Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I am here today at the IRCGN Ballistics Research Lab. This is the central firearms research collection of the French Gendarmerie, and they have very graciously let me come in today to take a look at a couple particularly interesting guns to show to you guys. What we have today is a MAS Model 62, and this is the rifle that France was considering adopting in order to meet NATO small arms standardization in the early 1960s. So there's quite a lot of backstory to this, and this rifle is the final result of 10 years of R&D by 4 different manufacturing facilities. So all 3 of the French primary state arsenals, the MAS, MAC, and MAT, the Toul, Châtellerault, and Saint-Étienne arsenals, all were involved in developing a new rifle for the French military, as was the research and development group at Mulhouse, which was largely based on some German R&D guys from Mauser. At any rate, in 1952, the French military decided to abandon its development work on an intermediate caliber small carbine, something that would have been the tactical equivalent of the Sturmgewehr 44. They'd been working on that from the late 40s, and in 52 they decided to cancel that program and stick with a rifle cartridge. Now, this would be the 7.5 French cartridge, which had of course been in French service for several decades at this point, and served them well, and they liked it. However, it was recognized that the NATO alliance was working on standardizing European small arms so that in the case of a war against the Soviet Union, you could dramatically simplify logistics. When the French start working on their rifle program in 52-53, there is no standard NATO cartridge yet. There would be as of 1954, when the T65 cartridge is formally adopted as 7.62 NATO. Now, once the cartridge is adopted, then NATO countries who are interested in joining this standardization, then they have to go about figuring out what rifle to use. So we're mostly familiar with this series of trials between the US and the UK and the Canadians that would result in the FAL being adopted, the EM2, or well, the FAL being adopted in Europe. The EM2 falls out, the US goes with the M14. Well, the question is, what is France doing during all of this? And the answer is, the French are looking at essentially 3 different options. Option number 1 is buy the FAL. There's a lot going for the FAL. It's well tested, especially by the time the French are ready to make a choice, which is 1962, hence the MAS Model 62. They could develop their own domestic rifle, and they in fact spend 10 years doing this. All manner of operating mechanisms and configurations are tested. They have bullpups, they have standard rifles, they have folding stocks, gas-operated, levered, like you name it. All sorts of things are tried, and hopefully we'll have a chance to do a series of videos on many of these prototypes in this development program. Option number 3 is to take the existing MAS 49 and then 4956 and simply convert it to 7.62 NATO. Option 4 is do nothing. So, before we talk about which of those options they chose, let's go ahead and take a closer look at this. So this particular example has had almost all of the paint worn off the receiver, but I should point out that these guns were made only in pre-production numbers. There were about 60 MAS 62s manufactured in total. It was enough to have run them through some initial basic developmental trials to know that the design was solid, and that they were then ready to put the gun into, basically ready to develop a production line should the military decide to actually adopt it. Now, before getting into this, the French had absolutely investigated the FAL. Of course, the FAL had been adopted by other NATO countries, many years earlier. It had become a well-proven design, and so it's natural that the Saint-Étienne arsenal would take a look at the FAL. And what they ended up doing here was copying a large percentage of the elements of the FAL, which you'll see as we take this apart. So let's start by taking a look at a few of the external features. We'll start with the markings here. This is Fusil Automatique, MAS Type 62, number 17, caliber 7.62 NATO. And then the lower assembly, I suppose we can call it, is also numbered. number 17. It's worth pointing out that this NO and a serial number is pretty typical of French pre-production guns. You'll see that on other models from the period. When they went into serial production, you would then start with typically a letter prefix and a sequential serial number. We have a 3-position selector lever here. So M is mécanique, which is full auto, S is safe, and C is coupe par coupe, or shot by shot, or semi-auto. The controls in front of the trigger guard duplicate those of the FAL. So this is your bolt release and manual bolt hold open, and this is a magazine release. The magazine holds 20 rounds. You can see that the nose catch of the magazine here is very much FAL-like. The back is pretty similar as well. We have a slightly, this is not a FAL magazine. This is not a modified FAL magazine. This is a made from scratch magazine, but it shares a number of FAL elements because of its lineage. Double stack, double feed, 20 rounds, and of course with that tab on the back of the follower, it will lock the gun open when it's empty. Unlike the MOS 4956, this is designed from the ground up with a proper pistol grip to it. It's really interesting looking at some of the elements that just are distinctively French here, and the charging handle is one of them. This looks like it came right off a MOS 4956, and frankly it probably did. We have a rear night sight here, as well as a more traditional, typical rear aperture sight. What is a bit less traditional is this very complex looking system for adjusting the windage and elevation, because the front sight is totally fixed in place. You have windage and elevation right here. So D and G are left and right, or right and left, and then this is your elevation adjustment, so you can adjust that as you need to for zeroing. This rear sight would have originally had luminous inserts in it, either radium paint or tritium, depending on the time period. And that folds down when not in use. The front sight is really very much, again, like the 4956. It's a fairly large barleycorn style post, fully encircled by a round shield, and in this case, not at all adjustable. So your adjustments are all done on the rear sight. There is what would have been your luminous front sight to go along with that flip down rear sight. And of course, this would have had the same grenade launching capabilities as the MOS 4956. So the gas system out here is essentially identical, or the gas cutoff system. So we have a muzzle brake, you have an adjustable stop here, which allows you to set the range for a rifle grenade. You then have your gas cutoff lever right there, and your grenade sight, which pull back, and you can lift up into one of 2 positions depending on which type of rifle grenade you are shooting. And so there's your ranges on the rear of the grenade sight. Now, where this gets a little bit different, and I don't have a good way to take the handguards off, but you can see inside there, this uses a short stroke gas piston system, very much like the FAL. So the cutoff is the same as the 4956. The 4956 is an actual true direct impingement gun. In this case, the gas block here feeds a little short tappet piston like a FAL. There is a block on the bottom of the handguard here for a detachable bipod. Unfortunately, I don't have a bipod to show you, but that's what that was for. There is a rubber case, ejected case buffer right there, and we have this reinforcement riveted onto the top cover of the rifle. That is for an optics mount, and we actually have the optics mount here. It's a bit complicated, but essentially this, by the way, this would have been for one of the APX L806 scopes, the same scope that was used on the FRF1 and on the MOS 4956, and that snaps onto the receiver right there. Probably not the world's sturdiest mount, but it probably would have been good enough. And lastly, I will point out that we have a sling swivel here on the front, and on the rear you can choose to attach this to a sling swivel on the bottom of the stock or one on the top of the stock. And lastly, just kind of an interesting point, this looks very much like an FR F1 or MOS 4956 MSE butt plate, for obvious reasons. One of the key elements in any sort of modern combat rifle is being easy to disassemble, and the MOS 62 certainly takes care of that. We have one pin here holding the upper and lower together, and I can press that pin out. It is not captive, it just comes out, and then I can take the lower receiver and it just sort of pulls back and pivots down and comes off the gun. I can then take the bolt handle, can pull out the striker and the bolt and bolt carrier. Now, before we take a closer look at the operating parts, I want to spend a minute here on the receiver. This is a very tight fitting, because of course it's got your optic mounted to it, very tight fitting sheet metal receiver cover. And I'm not going to take this off all the way because I don't know if I'll be able to get it back on. But if I slide that back and then show you this, that looks an awful lot like a FAL, doesn't it? We've got, in fact, fundamentally the same mechanics as a FAL. We've got our, I already showed you the manual bolt hold open here, magazine release, even to the point of having a magazine well that is sort of shielded on one side and cut away on the other. That's why the nose of the magazine here looks very similar to a FAL, because they are both attaching or locking in place the same way. There's a little cutout in the front of the receiver. It's a nose in and rock back style magazine with, of course, a pair of little rails here, grooves, for a sheet metal top cover, very much like a FAL. So sort of in the grand tradition of French small arms trials, they investigated everything that was out there, decided against buying anything as it existed from a commercial company, and then just taking all of the best elements and assembling them themselves by one of the state arsenals. By the way, this is your ejector. You can see it right in there. It's riveted in place, so easy to replace the ejector should you need to, and the ejector can be hardened independently of the rest of the receiver. Now, where this gets a little more curious is in the lower receiver. So the basic format here is just like the FAL, except there's no hammer. So the FAL is hammer fired. Our MOS 62 is striker fired. So you can see pulling down a sear right here to release a striker. This is your out of battery safety. This will hold the striker in place if the bolt's not forward. When the bolt is forward, it pushes that down out of the way. And then there's a disconnector built in for the semi-auto so that it can only fire one shot at a time. The question is, how did they adapt? Well, what does the bolt look like? So here is our bolt and carrier, and the thing that really jumps out at you first is how this is essentially a MOS 4956 bolt. It's not quite identical. You know, it's got a few features here that are slightly different, but clearly this rifle was designed with the intention of using the existing 4956 components. Now, whether this was, you know, kind of like the US, you know, we'll build the M14 on M1 tooling, or if it was a little more reality-based than that ended up being, I'm not sure. But clearly they wanted to start with an existing bolt design. Now, the 4956 is hammer-fired. What they have done here is create a system where it is actually sort of striker-fired instead, so that they can use a striker firing type lower assembly. So what will happen is when the gun is in battery, the bolt gets pushed back, and this little ramp pushes the bolt itself down. That's our locking surface right there, and it is going to lock into that surface right there, much like a FAL. And then to fire it, we have this assembly. So this nests into the bolt carrier, and it's got its sear engagement surface right there, and it is held back by the sear right here. When the sear drops, let's put that in battery. When the sear drops, this goes forward and hits the firing pin right there, firing it. Now what's interesting about this is two springs in one, so I can pull that out. It's a captive unit, thank goodness. that's your striker. When this is in, it can actually reciprocate back. So this is your striker spring, and then this is your spring acting on the bolt carrier. So really an interesting sort of compound, clever design there. And when it's all in place together, it's a simple, compact package. It's a really unusual system to take what was a hammer-fired bolt and adapt it to a striker system, but it actually seems like it would work just fine. I don't know exactly why the desire was to go to a striker firing system. It's possible that there were patents involved in the FAL that they wanted to get around. Not really sure on that. To be honest, there may have been some theoretical benefits that someone came up with why a striker would be better, perhaps more reliable, or simpler to manufacture than a hammer. But that is how they did the fire control system here. So if we look at the bottom of the receiver here, you can see that there are two cutout slots. A big one right there, and that is for the actual sear, and a small slot right there. So when the bolt's all the way in battery, this is our striker that comes in behind it. So that's the fired position, and this is the position where the striker is going to be sitting, held by the sear, right there, until you pull the trigger. Now that small little slot right there, that is for the out of battery safety, right here. And it is engaged by this curved surface right there. So when this goes the last bit forward, you'll be able to see it right in there. There it is, right there. It's going to push that safety stop up and out of the way. And of course, when this goes out of the way, it's going to drop that sear, leaving only this sear, which is manipulated by the trigger. So as long as that's up, even if I pull the trigger, the bolt can't go forward, or the striker can't go forward. So there is the whole MAS 62 system field stripped. Really a very simple rifle to take apart, easy to clean, no small components, really a pretty decent design. So the question is, did they adopt it? So what ultimately happened in 1963 is the decision was made to adopt no new standard rifle. The thing was, there's a lot of stuff that the French military needed to modernize and update. And when the general staff looked at replacing all the small arms, they were faced with kind of a tricky decision. Because on the one hand, if a war actually happens, yes, standard ammunition supply will be very helpful between all of the NATO allies. However, if a war doesn't happen, spending all this money, and we're talking something on the order of 200 million francs at the time, it gets them nothing. Technologically speaking, the only improvement that they would get from, say, buying the FAL would be having full automatic fire in the hands of every individual rifleman. And by this point, people are already realizing that full auto fire in 7.62 NATO is pretty much useless anyway. It makes sort of a pseudo light machine gun, but the French have a really good setup for light machine guns. They've got the 24-29, and at this point they've got the AA-52s as well. They don't need a light machine gun. Like the British end up taking full auto capability out of their FALs. The US ends up deprecating the M14s and removing its full auto capability. And so the French are looking at this and going, you know, we don't need the full auto. The cartridges are ballistically close enough as to be, like, there's no point in changing just for the change in ballistics. And we could take the money from standardizing a small arm caliber and instead put it into a different program, like a new medium tank, like nuclear missile programs, things that will have arguably a much greater significance on the battlefield than small arms ammunition logistics. And so that's what they end up doing. In 1963, they decide of all their three options for a 7.62 NATO rifle, they're going to go with none of them and just stick with the MAS 49-56 as it is. Now, it wouldn't be long after that that they would start developing the FAMAS, the fusil d'assaut, the assault rifle in 5.56. That, of course, is a whole separate story. And they would, in fact, end up moving to the 5.56 NATO cartridge with the adoption of the FAMAS. But I think it's been really cool to get a chance to take a look at one of the very small number of MAS 62s that were the option for a domestic manufacturer French NATO standardized combat rifle, battle rifle, if you will. A big thanks to the IRCGN, for the French Gendarmerie, for giving me access to this rifle. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.